September 1, 1715. Versailles, the Hall of Mirrors, 73 meters of glittering crystal and gold leaf, the most magnificent room in Europe, built to reflect the glory of one man. But today, the mirrors reflect something else. An old man lies dying in his bed. He is 77 years old. He has been king for 72 years, the longest reign in European history. His body is ravaged by gangrene, spreading from his leg through his entire body. The smell is unbearable. The pain is excruciating. And yet, even now, he performs. The courtiers file in. The rituals continue, because at Versailles the show never stops, not even when the star is rotting alive. This is Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who said, or at least the man who is said to have said, "L'état c'est moi, I am the state." He built the most opulent palace in history. He transformed France into the cultural capital of Europe. He turned his nobles into glorified servants and his court into a gilded prison. But here's the thing about building a cage for everyone else. Eventually, you realize you're trapped in it too. Prepare yourselves, friends. We're going to Versailles, and we're bringing air freshener. Before Louis became the Sun King, he was just a kid with a crown that was way too big for his head. He was born on September 5, 1638, at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. His parents had been married for 23 years without producing a living heir. When Louis finally arrived, they named him Louis d'Oudenay, Louis the God-given. The entire kingdom celebrated. This child, they believed, was a miracle. Then, in 1643, when Louis was just 4 years and 8 months old, his father died. The little boy became King of France. According to the laws of the kingdom, he was now not just the master, but the owner of the bodies and property of 19 million subjects. 4 years old, 19 million people. Think about that for a second. But Louis wasn't really in charge. His mother, Anne of Austria, served as regent, and the real power behind the throne was Cardinal Mazarin, an Italian-born minister who was hated by practically everyone in France. Then came the Fronde. The Fronde was a civil war that erupted in 1648. The nobles, the Paris Parliament, and pretty much anyone who hated Mazarin rose up against the crown. The royal family was forced to flee Paris. Louis, still just a child, experienced poverty, fear, humiliation, cold, and hunger. Imagine being 10 years old and watching your own subjects rebel against you. Imagine being forced to sleep in uncomfortable beds, eat whatever food you could find, and wonder if tomorrow would bring a mob at your door. Louis never forgot it. He never forgave Paris. He never forgave the nobles, and he developed a lifelong fear of rebellion that would shape everything he did as king. In 1653, Mazarin finally crushed the rebels. Louis was 15. He had learned his lesson. The nobles couldn't be trusted. Paris couldn't be trusted. The only person he could rely on was himself. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis made a decision that would change France forever. He announced that he would rule without a chief minister. He would be his own prime minister. He would be the absolute master of his kingdom. And then he started building. Louis XIV understood something that most rulers never figure out. Power isn't just about having an army. It's about controlling the narrative. It's about making sure everyone knows exactly who's in charge every second of every day. His weapon of choice, Versailles. The original Versailles was just a hunting lodge built by his father, Louis XIV, a modest little chateau in the woods, surrounded by swamps and marshes, not exactly prime real estate. But Louis saw potential. Starting in 1661, he began transforming this hunting lodge into the largest palace in Europe. The project would last for decades. At its peak, 60,000 workers were employed on the site. 36,000 men were mobilized over 53 years of construction. The cost was astronomical, 100 million livres, the equivalent of 100 million working days. It was, in the words of one historian, fearful, not in money alone, but in human life. In 1681 alone, 22,000 soldiers and 6,000 horses were employed on the work, and so unhealthy was the site that workers died by the thousands. But Louis didn't care about the cost. He didn't care about the death toll. He cared about the message. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a stage, and Louis was the star. In 1682, Louis officially moved his court to Versailles, and he made sure every single noble in France came with him. Think about what that meant. The French nobility had spent centuries building power bases in their own regions. They had their own castles, their own armies, their own influence. They were a constant threat to the crown. Louis solved that problem by making Versailles the only place to be. If you wanted the king's favor, and you did, you had to be at Versailles. If you wanted political power, and you did, you had to be at Versailles. If you wanted to marry well, get a good job, or just avoid being arrested, you had to be at Versailles. The nobles became prisoners of their own ambition. They spent their entire lives at the palace, competing for scraps of the king's attention, while their estates back home fell into ruin. Their power was gone. Their independence was gone. They were just puppets in Louis's show. And the show was relentless. Let's talk about daily life at Versailles, because if you think modern office politics are bad, you haven't seen anything. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he choreographed it. Every moment of every day was governed by an elaborate system of etiquette, rules so precise, so absurd, so incredibly French that they make modern bureaucracy look like a casual hangout. The lever, or how to get dressed in front of an audience. Every morning, Louis performed the lever du roi, the king's rising ceremony. This wasn't just getting out of bed. This was a carefully choreographed ritual that lasted almost 2 hours. The king's bedchamber was the center of the universe. A gilded balustrade separated the bed from the rest of the room. The most privileged courtiers, his brother, his son, were allowed inside the balustrade. Less important courtiers had to stand outside, and the least important, they weren't even allowed in the room. As Louis got dressed, different nobles were honored with different tasks. The highest-ranking noble in attendance handed the king his shirt, but here's where it gets ridiculous. According to a contemporary account, one morning, a count was handing Louis his waistcoat when a duke walked in. Etiquette demanded that the count immediately hand the waistcoat to the duke, because you couldn't have a lower-ranked noble touching the king's garments when a higher-ranked noble was present. But the duke was wearing gloves. He had to remove them before he could touch the waistcoat. He was just about to take the garment when the door opened again, and a royal prince walked in. The duke immediately handed the waistcoat to the prince, but the prince was also wearing gloves. He had to remove them too. And then another prince walked in, a higher-ranking one. Louis stood there in his underwear in a cold room waiting for his waistcoat. He caught a violent chill, all because of etiquette. This is what Versailles was like, every single day. The petit couvert, or eating dinner like a zoo animal. Louis ate his meals in public, not just in front of his family, in front of whoever happened to be watching. Hundreds of courtiers would gather to watch the king eat. When the cook brought in the meat, he was attended by armed soldiers and preceded by a herald shouting, "Gentlemen, the king's viands." Everyone in the room would remove their hats. The sentinels would salute the roast chicken. When the king was about to drink, a chamberlain announced the fact at the top of his voice. Two tasters, whose job it was to prove the wine wasn't poisoned, stepped forward, poured out a little, and drank it. Then the king drank. Imagine being a nobleman who fought in wars, who commanded armies, who owned half of France, and now you're saluting a roast chicken because the king is about to eat it. This wasn't just theater. This was psychological warfare. The right to sit, or how to destroy someone's self-esteem. At Versailles, even sitting down was a political statement. Courtiers were not permitted to sit on just any chair in the presence of just anyone. The rules were so complex that nobles spent hours discussing who could sit where, on what kind of chair, and in whose presence. If the king offered you a taburet, a small folding stool, it was the honor of a lifetime. If you were offered a pliant, a different kind of stool, it meant something else entirely. And if you weren't offered a chair at all, you stood, for hours, in high heels, in a room full of people who were all pretending not to notice your humiliation. This was how Louis controlled his nobles. He didn't need to execute them. He just needed to make them compete for a waistcoat, for a stool, for the chance to watch him brush his teeth. The golden cage, or why nobody could leave. Here's the genius of Louis's system. The nobles couldn't leave even if they wanted to. If you left Versailles, you lost access to the king. If you lost access to the king, you lost political power. If you lost political power, your rivals at court would destroy you. So you stayed, and you competed, and you spent your entire fortune on fancy clothes and expensive parties, trying to impress a man who had already decided you didn't matter. Versailles was a golden cage, and everyone inside it knew exactly what they were, prisoners. The hygiene, or why Versailles smelled like a barn. And now, friends, we come to the part of the story that history books usually leave out: the smell. Louis XIV was, by all accounts, a dirty king, not because he was lazy, because 17th century medicine believed that baths were dangerous. Doctors thought water opened the pores and let miasmas, bad air, into the body, causing disease, so nobody bathed, ever. Louis bathed perhaps once in his entire life. His morning routine was simple. He put on a clean shirt and splashed a little water on his face. That was it. That was the entire royal hygiene regimen. The king smelled badly, he knew it. According to contemporaries, when Louis entered a room, he would open the windows first, so he wouldn't overwhelm his courtiers with his odor. He doused himself in perfume, but it barely helped. His bed was infested with fleas. Servants watched them jump around without any particular surprise. Even Madame de Maintenon, his second wife, the woman who shared his bed, admitted to her friends that the king did not smell good. But Louis wasn't the only one who stank. The entire palace reeked. Courtiers relieved themselves under the staircases and behind the doors. There were no flushing toilets. Chamber pots had to be emptied manually by servants. The palace was, in the words of one historian, the least clean place in the kingdom. Imagine walking through the Hall of Mirrors, the most beautiful room in Europe. Gold lath, crystal chandeliers, 357 mirrors reflecting the light, and beneath your feet, puddles of urine, because someone didn't make it to the chamber pot in time, because the chamber pot was overflowing, because nobody wanted to empty it. This, friends, is the reality behind the myth. Versailles wasn't just a palace, it was a sewer with really nice wallpaper. The Mistresses, or How to Make Your Wife Jealous. Louis had a string of official mistresses, the most famous being Louise de la Vallière and the Marquise de Montespan. He had them installed in apartments adjacent to his own. The Queen had to just deal with it. Louise de la Vallière was sweet, pious, and genuinely in love with the king. But Louis got bored. Enter Madame de Montespan, intelligent, cultured, dazzlingly beautiful. She ousted La Vallière and became the king's official mistress in 1674. And then, after Montespan fell from favor, Louis married his second wife, Madame de Maintenon, a woman he had initially hired as a governess for his illegitimate children. She was older, less glamorous, and deeply religious. She also didn't bathe, which, at Versailles, was probably a plus. For all his brilliance as a courtier, Louis was a disaster as a statesman. The second half of his reign was a slow-motion train wreck. The wars. Between 1667 and 1697, Louis fought a series of wars to expand France's borders. They were expensive, they were destructive, and they ultimately achieved very little. By the end of the century, France was exhausted and deeply in debt. But Louis couldn't stop. In 1701, he plunged France into the War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict that lasted 13 years and pitted France against a hostile European coalition. The war drained the treasury, devastated the countryside, and killed hundreds of thousands of French soldiers. By 1714, France was broke. The people were starving, and the Sun King was still spending money on Versailles like nothing had changed. The Revocation. In 1685, Louis made one of the worst decisions of his reign. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, the law that had protected French Protestants, Huguenots, since 1598. Louis was a devout Catholic. He believed that religious unity was essential to his absolute authority, so he outlawed Protestantism in France. Protestant churches were destroyed, Protestant schools were closed, and when peaceful conversion didn't work, Louis resorted to dragonnades, forcing Protestant families to house soldiers who would then torture them until they converted. The result, a mass exodus. Over 200,000 Huguenots fled France, taking their skills, their wealth, and their industries with them. France suffered a brain drain that would take generations to recover from, all because Louis wanted everyone to worship the same way he did. The death. In the summer of 1715, Louis began complaining of a pain in his leg. The doctors thought it was sciatica. It wasn't, it was gangrene. The infection spread rapidly. By mid-August, gangrene had set in. The king's body began to rot from the inside out. The pain was unimaginable, and yet, even then, Louis performed. He received visitors. He continued the rituals. He died as he had lived in public. On September 1, 1715, at 8:15 in the morning, Louis XIV died. He was 77 years old. He had been king for 72 years and 110 days. His body was embalmed. His heart was removed and placed in a silver casket. His organs were distributed among various churches, and his remains were laid to rest in the Basilica of Saint Denis. But here's the irony. Within a century, the French Revolution would tear down everything he had built. Versailles would be ransacked, the monarchy would be abolished, and Louis's great-grandson, the man who inherited his throne, would lose his head to the guillotine. The Sun King built a golden cage for his nobles, but in the end, he built a cage for France itself, and when the cage finally broke, it broke everyone inside it. So what do we take away from Louis XIV? First, the power of distraction. Louis understood that if you keep people busy enough, they won't have time to rebel. He gave his nobles a never-ending circus of rituals, rivalries, and petty humiliations. They were so focused on winning the king's favor that they forgot they had their own power bases. They were too busy fighting over chairs to notice they'd lost their castles. It's the oldest trick in the book, and it still works today. Second, the danger of absolute power. Louis genuinely believed he was the state. He said it, he lived it. But absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it isolates. Louis surrounded himself with sycophants who told him what he wanted to hear. He built a palace so magnificent that he couldn't see the poverty outside its gates. He waged wars so destructive that he bankrupted his own kingdom. By the end of his reign, France was a shadow of what it had been. The people were starving, the treasury was empty, and the king was rotting in a bed that smelled like a sewer. Third, the cost of spectacle. Versailles was a masterpiece. It still is. Thousands of tourists visit every year, marveling at the Hall of Mirrors, the gardens, the sheer audacity of it all. But the beauty came at a price paid in human lives, a price paid in taxes, a price paid in the dignity of every noble who was forced to compete for the privilege of handing the king his underwear. Louis XIV built the most magnificent palace in history, and then he filled it with the most miserable people in Europe. So here's your takeaway, friends. Louis XIV spent his entire life building a cage for everyone else. He trapped the nobles at Versailles. He trapped France in endless wars. He trapped himself in a ritual so elaborate that he couldn't even get dressed without catching a cold. He believed he was the Sun King, the center of the universe, the source of all light and life. But in the end, he was just a man who smelled bad, who lived in a palace that smelled worse, and who died in agony while his courtiers watched. He ruled for 72 years. He built the most famous palace in the world. He made France the cultural capital of Europe. And then he died, alone in a golden room, surrounded by people who had spent their entire lives trying to impress him. and who couldn't wait for him to finally shut up. The Sun King set, and the darkness that followed lasted for generations. So the next time you see a picture of Versailles, remember, behind the gold leaf and the crystal chandeliers, there's a story about power, vanity, and the human cost of absolute control. Louis XIV reigned from 1643 to 1715. His reign was the longest in European history. He built Versailles, revoked the Edict of Nantes, and transformed France into the cultural center of Europe. He died of gangrene at the age of 77, leaving behind a bankrupt kingdom and a legacy that would eventually be swept away by revolution. And some, here in the Hall of Mirrors, the Sun King is still waiting for someone to hand him his waistcoat.